Welcome to New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. I'm your host, Sean. Tonight I wanted to talk about, a subject that's kind of near and dear to my heart, the M1, and how military, the American military that is, how our nomenclature for rifles is confusing as hell. Okay, so the M1 Garand served from World War II through Korea into Vietnam. It was still kind of used. It was used post-World War II by a lot of countries. It was rechambered to the 308 to keep it in service longer. It was the derivative model, meaning that its design was key influence in the M1A or the M14. Some of the design aspects, the tilting bolt, how it tilts and how it rotates, or the rotating bolt, not tilting bolt, was an influence for the M1 carbine. I had a friend recently who was talking about an M1, and I thought he was talking about an M1 Garand, because to me there is only one M1, because I always think of M1 Carb. I always follow that up because that's how my dad did it, but it goes without saying that if you look at American military weapons and how they name them, it's confusing as hell. Because I believe that if I look hard enough, I could actually find texts that refer to the Thompson as the M1 Thompson. Okay, because it was the first submachine gun. Now, I also think that I can find rifles designation or falsely labeled articles as the 1903 is the M1 1903. So it makes a lot of sense. There'd be a lot of confusion around it. So first off, let's talk about the differences between the M1 Garand and the M1 carbine. So for most of my audience, my close friends, they probably already know this. I'm going to tell you what the real difference is. One's a pistol caliber rifle, carbine, and it was designed, the M1 carbine that is, was designed for not frontline soldiers. So what I mean by that are people that were, support troops, to have an arm that wasn't as expensive to build or as expensive to keep fed with ammunition. So they use the M1 carbine because it uses less brass, less bullet weight, and less powder, so that they could keep frontline soldiers armed with something enough to stand off somebody. Okay, now you would think that, why wouldn't you just use a pistol? Well, in some cases, if infiltrators got behind enemy lines, a pistol just wouldn't do it, especially when the only pistol that the American military was servicing was the 1911. Okay, and I actually believe it is called the M1 1911 pistol. So why is this a problem? Well, if you've ever fired a .30 carbine, or an M1A carbine, or M1 carbine, let's do that, because M1A carbine is a 308 and is a civilian derivative of the M14. But what you've noticed is with the M1 carbine is you had 15 rounds, 10 rounds, and 30 round magazines for this weapon. And anyone who's ever shot a pistol caliber carbine will tell you that having more rounds is better because they're not as effective and you're not going to get the range out of that. So it gives you a lot of firepower in a very small package. You're not having to carry around a 9-pound M1 Garand. You're carrying around like a 5 or a 6-pound M1 carbine. And this makes a lot of sense for support troops, people that aren't, frontline fighters during the war. Why would they need a 30-06 or carry an M1 Garand around? And a lot of officer dudes carried M1 carbines. A lot of airborne troops carried it because it's lightweight and it was easy to parachute in with this weapon. And that weapon served alongside the M1 Garand all the way up to and through Vietnam. Vietnam, it was kind of deprecated. It was already showing its lack of firepower, but it had a lot of firepower in a small package, and that's what kind of led the Americans down the idea of a smaller intermediate cartridge, that and capturing the STG-44. So if we look at development, what was happening in the United States is we've always prided ourselves on being marksmen, okay? Our soldiers specifically, soldiers and Marines. So that means we can take long shots at targets, somewhere 500 meters to 1,000 meters, or 500 yards to 1,000 yards, is what the military mindset was at the time. And what the Germans had figured out during World War II is that if you were fighting, more often than not, your combat ranges were less than 300 yards or 300 meters in the military, or the metric system. If you don't know what the difference is between a meter and a yard, it's 10% difference. The meter is 10% larger. Okay, that doesn't go for a kilometer, though. A kilometer is about, I think there's 3.38 or something like that for a mile. So a mile is a lot bigger. Why do I say things in military terms, like meters? Number one, I'm a fan of the metric system. For being an American, that's weird. But I was raised with a lot of military dudes in my life, and it makes sense to just refer to it in meters. If you ever do any metrics conversions, it's just literally moving a decimal place for metric conversions for doing meters to kilometers and so on and so forth. And that makes a lot of sense to me, being a kind of a math geek too. But I digress. So during World War II, we had the 30-06. Now, the M1 Garand was actually designed to be chambered in a .277 caliber, a .270 caliber. But because of World War I, and we had a large stock of 30-06 ammunition because of the M1903 Springfields and the P17 or the P14, I forget which one. One's a 303 and one's a 30-06. We fielded both, believe it or not, in World War I. We fielded all three, if you count the Springfield. But the .06 was our mainstay, including the machine guns. So what we chambered our M1 Garand in, there's some bean counters that said, hey, we can't change to a new caliber, even though it was flatter shooting. They decided to go back to the drawing board. They made John Garand go back to the drawing board and redesign it in a .06. Which was basically rebarreling it and tuning the gas system accordingly. John Garand is a Canadian designer, so that's weird that we have American designers, but think about this time frame in history. In World War II, it was kind of all hands on deck, and when I say all hands on deck, Canada, the UK, France, we all kind of teamed up with Australia and New Zealand. Those are Commonwealth countries of the UK. Kind of teamed up to fight the Nazis. That means that we were sharing designs, we were sharing intelligence, we were trying to get our war machine geared up to fight World War II. Now, if you look at the pre-design, we were the first country to field a semi-automatic, a self-loading rifle in mass. So we didn't just hand bolt-action rifles to our servicemen when World War I started, or World War II started. We still had a lot of bolt-action rifles in service throughout World War I, especially in the Pacific Theater, because we were trying to hand out M1s, and then some of the Marines in the Pacific Theater didn't want to change rifles. Use the same caliber, but it was heavier, a little less handy if you've ever handled one of these weapons. But it put us ahead of what the Germans and the Japanese were carrying. Now, the Germans were carrying the K98 because Hitler, that was their main battle rifle. So Hitler was a big fan of the K98 because of World War I, because he served it as a private in an artillery corps, kind of an intelligence observer type dude. And he fell in love with the rifle because that's all the Germans needed. And this held the German war machine back, because the German war machine was already fielding self-loading rifles, or trying to. And Hitler stopped that because he saw that there wasn't a need for it. Despite what he said, they did some development behind the scenes, and you ended up with Hitler's M1, which is the G43. This is one of the rifles I've talked about a lot of times. I've shot one. They're great rifles. They're horrible designs, though. when I say from a manufacturing perspective. There's a lot of pieces, parts that can go wrong with manufacturing it. Imagine wartime economy where you're trying to find certain types of steel, certain hardnesses of steel, and you're just trying to make weapons because you're in a fight for your life, whether you egged it on or not. Okay. In the United States, we didn't have that problem. We were already tooled up to make the M1. We were making them in mass, and that's what we deployed with. So the K98 it was a 5-round Mauser rifle. The Japanese rifle was a 7.7 or a 6.5 Arisaka round, and it's basically a Mauser derivative. So it was a 5-round magazine. An M1 Garand carries 8 rounds in a clip, an actual clip. So why is that a big difference? It doesn't sound like a big deal until you're in a firefight where you have 3 extra rounds to continue the fight. And the fact that you could load said rifle with another 8 rounds really rapidly made a difference in combat. That little clip that we laugh at has a noise when it kicks out. And I've talked about how I thought my dad's rifle broke when I first saw it, and my dad shot it. And when he finished the 8th round, the little magazine, or the little clip, not the magazine, the little clip goes ting and pops out. It's a dead giveaway, the gun's empty. You look at the .30 carbine, and you have detachable box magazines. That's a big deal for this time era. Understand that in Europe, let's use the UK for example, they're using 1903, they're using Enfield rifles, 303 British rifles is what we call them in the United States. But they're 10-round box-fed magazines that are fixed, that are fed with a stripper clip from the top, and groups of 5. Now, the 303 British, or the Enfield rifles, had a smooth action, but they were not a semi-automatic. Okay. If you look at the Germans, they were fielding 3 main rifles at the time. And that means in a wartime economy, you're trying to rob Peter to pay Paul to make these 3 rifles. And technically, I think it was closer to 4 or 5 at the end of the war. We didn't do that. The United States, we just focused our economy on weapons that fit the roles of the person. So we made the M1 the battle rifle, its primary rifle for our services. The M1 carbine for support soldiers. We had a submachine gun. We actually had 2. Technically, we had 3, but there's one that never made it really into service. I think it's called the M2 or the M3, something like that. There's a grease gun. That was one of the primary submachine guns of the war towards the end of the war, because it could be made by stamping steel. This was a newer technology during this era of making firearms. And then we had the Thompson. And the Thompson, the reason why the M3 grease gun came around was because the Thompson was expensive to make, was heavier, and it used a lot more steel. And if you think about wartime economy, you're trying to preserve as many resources as you possibly can. So if you could make an M3 grease gun for like $6 or $3, whatever the wartime economy was for it, versus, $100 or $20 for the Thompson, it makes a lot of sense. Well, the M1 Garand already had enough tooling and enough machining underneath it that it was becoming really, really cheap to keep producing. The M1 carbine, sharing some of the machining for its stock, but having entirely different wartime production facilities, allowed it to be built in tandem. Okay, when you compare that to the Germans, their wartime economy was where they were taking the Mauser Works factory in Germany, and they were producing the K98 at a maddening pace. And every country they absorbed, take Czechoslovakia as an example, had a Mauser manufacturing company there, and they tooled those guys up to make K98 rifles for them too. Where the intermediate cartridge starts to come into play, as we're seeing the usefulness and utility of the M1 carbine, the Germans kind of leapfrogged us, and they took the 7.92 by 33 cartridge. So they took the 8mm Mauser. It's known as that in the United States, but it's a 7.92 by 5.7mm Mauser. And they kept the bullet, lightened it a little bit, and shortened the cartridge case up to 33mm, down from 57mm. And what this allowed them to do is get 33 rounds in a magazine. And now you have a cartridge that's basically the close equivalent to the modern cartridge would be like a 300 Blackout or like a 7.62 by 39 Russian round, because the Russian round was pretty close to cloning it anyway. That came up in the Kalashnikov's development, is that round specific style of round was how he tailored the rifle around the AK around that round. What the Germans saw specifically, is on the Eastern Front, this had a huge benefit. And this gun was manufactured kind of disguised by German procurement as the MP 44. And what that meant was it was a machine pistol. When Hitler finally was made aware of it, that they were manufacturing, he took it as like, wow, this is a great wonder rifle. Wunderwaffe is what they call them, wonder weapons. After the war, we captured, of course, STG-44s, and we started doing research on them. That led us to kind of downsize our cartridge to the 308. But because of the procurement, 7.62 by 51 at the time, what led us down that route, though, was we weren't going to go as small as the intermediate cartridge that we know and love today, that the grandfather of the modern intermediate cartridge. We still wanted that precision, so we needed a 308. And naturally, since the M1 Garand was in such plentiful supply, we're in a peacetime economy now, before Korea. They chambered the M1 in that caliber, because it uses the same bullet, basically, so they could use the basics to make the rifling for the barrel, but they changed the chamber dimensions so that you could use a 7.62 by 51, later the 308, the American 308. And it actually became, I think it was originally the American 308 before it became the 7.62 by 51. Then we started thinking, hey, you know what? It'd be great if we had a box magazine. And there were some prototypes during the war with box magazines, like the M14 for the M1 Garand. So imagine a 30-06 with a BAR magazine. An M1 Garand with a BAR magazine, basically. You built a heavier rifle. So our designers went to work and they made the M14. Now, when the M14 goes through its teething its teething period in Vietnam, we realize it's not gonna cut the mustard. Number one, we're running up against Kalashnikovs, which 20 rounds in a magazine versus 30 rounds, there's a huge power discrepancy, especially in close battles. That means that you're carrying less ammunition into the field. That means you're going to have to reload sooner, and that means that they're in mass, and that's what the Vietnamese were doing, is fighting in mass. We were behind a power curve. Take it also that this is a heavier gun. That's when the Americans leapfrogged and made the M16. Now the M16... again, the bean counters get involved and screwed it up. They wanted to use some of that old powder that we've had since World War II, and that caused system problems with the M16. So that's a little bit of the history of the M1 Garand. What is the big difference, though? If you really look at it, it has to do with ballistics and their role and what they were doing. And you can see how American firearms design goes down that pathway to this day. You see that we have these periods where we have a do-it-all rifle. That's what the M14 is. And that's kind of what the M16 became. But now you look at what we went to with the M7 now. It used to be called the M5. It's now called the M7 because apparently there was an M5 prototype at some point. The M7 is that 277 Fury, or the 6.8 by 51, I think is what it's called, what its technical military title is. And they're hoping to field these, and the Army has adopted this, as a do-it-all rifle for everyone, to give them the long range, to give them the optics, to do all the other stuff. They still employ submachine guns, though, because they've noticed when you kick down doors, you need something smaller, lighter, and handier. But the battlefield in Afghanistan specifically showed us we needed something with more range, more effective range than area range, because the 5.56 isn't really great for distances over 500 meters. But you see the difference that came up in this conversation was, why is there so many different M1s? And I had to think about that and ponder it before I answered it, but I think I've answered the question for you guys. And I thought it was an interesting thought exercise to kind of air out on my podcast, right, on New Mexico Black Rifle Operators Union. What else has been going on in the world is you're seeing more court cases. You're seeing the company, not the company, well, they are companies, the organizations like FPC and GOA going hard after the American government. Specifically, the big fight right now is if you sell a gun, you're now considered a firearms dealer and you should have an FFL. And there's a lot of cases rallying around us as gun owners, saying that you are not an FFL if you sell a gun. Okay? And that's how it should be. The fact of the matter is, this is a way that the Biden administration specifically is trying to weaponize the ATF, thanks to Trump, giving them that power to go after American gun owners and work towards civilian disarmament. I mean, we have a rich history. Just listen to what I just talked about with the M1, and that's just one gun in our American arsenal that we have. You know, the other one I was thinking about, other topic I think about, and I'll probably save it, and I'll do it for tomorrow night to be dropped on Thursday and Friday for the, that's what I'm going to start producing content for, is what are the modern guns that we're going to, hold on to? What are we going to collect? The M1 Garand is a collector rifle right now. It is one of those prize pieces for American shooters and even some European shooters to have in their collection because of the history involved there. And so is the K98. But if you look at the world's history and what guns are throughout the world, is the M16 or the AR-15 derivatives going to be that collector? I mean, there are a dime a dozen now, and there's more and more countries adopting it because of its serviceability and because of its modularity and because it really is the perfection of hundreds of years of rifle development. So it makes a lot of sense. But what about the G36, the German G36? There's a lot of bad press that went out about its being a polymer frame or a polymer receiver with a steel trunnion or a steel barrel. And was that really warranted? I mean, if you look at what its performance was, no, it wasn't. It performed as designed right up until they found out that the barrels were wearing out in the gun more so than it actually heating up. And that was what the controversy is, or was around it. Is that a collector's item? What about the SA-80 series from England, the Enfield? This is, by all metrics, the biggest lop of crap military rifle that's ever been hoisted on a military force. But after HK, a German company, got a hold of it, they unfornicated the gun. It's still an 11-pound 5.56, though. Is it going to be a collector's item? Will the United States ever see them? Because of the way the political environment is in the world, will we ever get a chance to hold one of these and actually get the ones or twos that the English government would ever let go? The UK government? I doubt it. I don't know that. I mean, I know that there's an appetite for Americans to get their hands on it because it's one of those historical weapons. But it really is a piece of crap by all metrics. I mean, the first SA-80 failed miserably, or SA-85, not the SA-80. The SA-80, I believe, is actually the FNFL, the FAL. Okay, but the SA-85 is the first version of the Bullpup 5.56 that had so many issues, and it had issues with reliability. It had issues with magazines. It had issues with magazines falling out of the guns. To this day, it is not a left-handed shooter's gun. If you're left-handed and you're in the British military, guess what? You just became a right-handed shooter, because it will hit you in the face if you shoot it left-handed. That's poor design. And if you look at the culture in the UK, they're a victim of their own culture. In the United States, we have this culture where guys have been, young kids, guys and girls, have been exposed to firearms long enough that if they wanted to, they could try to design something new, try to be innovative and do something. They have access to the technology, and they have access to shooting these American rifles so that they could come up with new designs. In the UK, they don't have that. Guns are banned and have been banned for over 20 years now, basically. It hasn't stopped the violence in the UK, so, there is that, and that's a good signpost for us in the 2A to keep our rights. But as I've noticed more and more, nothing's really changing. I wanted to try to do something a little more innovative, talk about what I'm passionate about. I love history. I love the firearms history, the history attached to these firearms. I know the M1 Garand's history very well. I know the K98 history probably better, and I could go off for hours on this, and I have to some of my friends who listen to my podcast. There's a lot of guys that talk to me and say, hey, man, you and Ian from Forgotten Weapons should hang out. I absolutely agree. I'd love to buy Ian a beer and just sit there and talk to him about guns, because he's seen everything, where I'm not, being a poor guy who got into this type of thing because it's a hobby for me and a passion. I've never had access to the stuff he has. He's traveled the world to go to museums and see these pieces and actually examine the designs and see the thought process. He's actually got to see some of the blueprints and stuff of these gun designs. And, a lot of his stuff is esoteric unless you're a gun guy like me, who's really enthused by seeing how evolution of design was built into this puzzle that we have. And that's what has always hooked me about the 2A. But I look at those guns in the world right now, and I'm wondering, what are the collector ones? A lot of them are derivatives of American designs, because we're still innovating. No one else is. Let me know. Email me, atin082@gmail.com, with some ideas of what you want to talk about, or what you want me to talk about, do some more research on, or something you're interested in. If it's something you're interested in about what are the collector's guns, I don't know if they'll be worth anything. A lot of my guns that I have now are, take the Luger I have, even though it's nickel plated because I wanted a shooter, it's still probably worth a little more than your average Glock, And I think that's what's kind of exciting about the 2A. Like, share, subscribe, most importantly, be great.